Hi everyone, my name's Dana McCoskey. Before we get started, hopefully everyone can use the chat. I was just curious if anyone is actually growing hops or if anyone's made any beer before with hops. So feel free to just let me know because that will indicate in the chat the types of people in the classes. And it hopefully will help me steer the content a little bit. This is really an introductory class. We started out doing this class maybe 5 years ago. I'm a hobby gardener and brewer, and I noticed there were some delightful looking hops growing at Wangari Garden. And so I started talking to Josh about harvesting them because they were in the communal area. And then Josh actually started bringing some of his garden interns over to my house, and we did some brewing instruction. And that was around when I first moved to DC. And then since then, I have my own hops growing, and I planted some in the community gardens as well. So we're going to touch on, whatever you really want to know about, but in general, really celebrating the hops plant. And hopefully my screen will advance. Okay, so a little bit about me. I'm from Michigan. I lived in Oregon for almost 11 years. I'm a fish and wildlife biologist, so I have a lot of general knowledge about plants, animals, interactions between plants and animals. And I'm kind of a neurotic maker. I'm always, brewing something, cooking something, growing something. As soon as one garden bed is done, I'm on to the next one. And I really got interested in beer out in Oregon. There's so many breweries. When I was an undergrad, I, couldn't believe that these people I went to school with were studying to be brewmasters. I didn't know that was a career. And so I really got into this with friends. And Oregon is actually a really hoppy area. And we'll learn a little bit more about that later, but it's one of the really key areas for research into different strains of hops. So I learned a lot from working in the field with birds, going out into farm country, forest lands, talking to people that own land that were growing hops. And when I came here, it was a big question of, can you grow hops in the city? And the answer is, spoiler, yes. So what do I use my hops for? For beer, I also purchased some hops. I don't have a big farm where I can have a lot of different types growing. I make these yoga eye pillows and I put hops in them. And I also use it for just privacy screening. So there's other uses that we'll talk about, but that's what I use my hops for. So our outline today we're going to cover is just some high notes in the history of hops, uses, of course, brewing and bottling beer. And I've put a little bit more content in on that just because in the past people wanted to know more about the beer than the hops. And so, we can skip through it if you guys aren't as interested in that. But just the hops plant in general, some growing information, some information about different varieties of hops, and some resources to get you going. So the history of hops is really kind of fun to learn about. There's a lot of information on the internet, and there are also some really great books. It's very connected to beer and brewing history. And fun facts to know and tell, there were actually hops in Babylon. Hops came from the first record of hops in Europe comes from Germany. You can think of the beer culture in Bavaria. And these were wild plants that were just growing in ditches that people started utilizing. But it was actually the Dutch that first started brewing with hops. And in England, they really, they popularized this one type of hops called Fugel hops, which a lot of the American ales don't utilize. But you'll see that if you go to the beer store and if you get into different types of recipes, maybe that are different than my taste, which are mostly like stouts and IPAs. So the hops plant traveled over to the New World with English and Dutch farmers in the 1600s. And it wasn't until really the 80s, where there was a lot of new varieties that were cultivated by the USDA and other academic research institutions. So the university that I used to work for in Oregon, Oregon State University, had a very large research department, and there's tons of peer-reviewed journal articles and things like that that have come out of that school, and a lot of the hops that you see in the beer that you may get at the store, both like East Coast, West Coast beers, use these strains. So the Willamette Valley is kind of the center of a lot of the more popular, at least I think they're more popular. I think there's a trend in beer to do sours now, but the hoppy beers, a lot of those hops are either classic or from the Willamette Valley. And so I think what I recommend the most is if, sorry, I'm closing the chat. I'm just looking over at what people have said. I think, you know, if there's beers that you like, I would say just Google them if it doesn't have the information on the bottle. That will help you understand more like which types of hops that you might be interested in, and it will help you start the pathway to, you know, if you want to actually grow hops at your house and use them for beer, to give you an idea of what you should focus on. And I'll talk a little bit more later about which ones actually grow well here. Something that I haven't done really exhaustive experiments on, but I do have a little bit of knowledge on it. So what are hops used for? Beer, of course. Early ales didn't have any hops in them. The Germans defined beer as barley, malt, and hops. So that's really the origin, is that Bavarian beer. Ale is a generic term for a type of beer that's fermented with an ale yeast. There's also lagers, and these are different types of yeast organisms that utilize different temperatures, and ales are top fermenting and lagers are bottom fermenting. So there are some nuances between the different types of beer, just in the ingredients that have nothing to do with the hops. But it was really the English that started using strong hops that have become very popular in the last decade in Indian pale ales for shipping beer to India when they had the colony there. Hops also have a lot of medicinal qualities, and they help with sleeping. So, you know, you may, if you drink beer, feel sleepy maybe from alcohol, but there's also a variety of different medicinal sleep assistance associations with hops. I really like them for shade and screening. I live in Bloomingdale. We don't have a lot of privacy, you know, like we're next to our neighbors. We hear our neighbors. And so hops not only create a beautiful type of screen, but also can provide some shade. They're actually able to provide habitat for birds and other animals. A lot of times, if you have quite a few of them, it can provide cover for fledgling birds for you know, avoidance of predators. And there are some really cool ecological associations with native bees, honeybees, butterflies, and other beneficial insects, which are really the base of a lot of our food chains for wildlife here. And I put 4 different types of butterflies down here that have an association with hops. I've actually seen this red admiral in my garden in extremely urban DC, so I thought that was kind of cool. And that's the one on the far left. And I've seen the gray hair streak also in some of the DC community gardens. So I think it's really cool. And I don't know if it's because of the hops or other plants there, but there's a lot of wildlife benefit to having hops as well. Okay, so beer making and brewing basics. I'm going to open the chat up one more time if I can figure out how. Just give me a second. Okay. So I really want someone to confirm that you guys can see me when I'm speaking. So there's this book, and let me make sure that I can see myself so I can position the book. The Joy of Home Brewing. Can you guys see that? Anyway, if you can't, I can give you more information. And I just wanted to say that this quote at the top of the slide is from this book. And I really recommend it as a reference for making beer. It has a lot of simple and great recipes. And yeah, I'm looking at, okay, you guys can see it. Cool. It has a lot of really great information and it's easy to follow. So if you don't have this book and you want to start making beer, especially with your own hops that you grow, I would just say get this book. I use it over and over again. I have favorite recipes in the book. It's really never let me down. And I see a lot of recipes on the internet for food and things like that. And often I find really good recipes on the internet for, you know, whatever it is, like making granola, baking a cake, making bread. Most of the recipes that I've tried on the internet for beer have not been as successful as just with some of these published books. And so I'd say start here as opposed to just trying to find a beer recipe online. But that's just been my experience. Maybe others have different experiences. So, you know, what do you have to do if you're going to make beer and do a brew? You have to really do a lot of planning. You have to get equipment, and later I'll show you, I'm actually surrounded here at my kitchen table with a lot of different beer making equipment. You have to figure out your recipe. You have to think about time management. There are so many times where I've been really super motivated to make 2 batches of beers, you know, like have some friends over, you know, have some pizzas or something like that. And been up till 2 in the morning, still making my beer, you know, getting my house up to over 100 degrees. So it actually takes a couple hours to make a beer, and, you know, you have to do all the sanitation and prep. So really think it out if you're going to do it. I have a beer journal. It's just this, you know, little black book of information. I'm a scientist, so I record everything. If you want to master beer making, oftentimes you'll try a recipe and you want to change it a little bit. So you can be very scientific and use that same recipe and change one thing in, you know, in increments, or, you know, swap out ingredients. But having notes about what it was that made that one beer so great helps. So I write down everything from exactly what I put into the beer. I sometimes tape my purchase order from the store into my journal. I, you know, take the temperature and write down how long and when I did things, anything to help me piece together why certain beers are better than others. It's really important to me too to point out that sometimes the water that you use will add a certain taste to the beer. Some people use distilled water. I use filtered tap water, but it's really interesting when you start traveling around and you've made beer, you can actually tell things. Like when I was in Iceland, I was just like, I feel like I can taste like the slight saltiness of like this glacial water in this beer. So every ingredient counts. Like you may just think, you know, some of them are similar, but even different brands can have a totally different taste to what you're making. So it's really important to record everything. You know, your ingredients: water, sugars, malted barley, of course your hops, yeast, which is a living organism. And, you know, just in general, as far as the hops go, there are different types of hops. There's boiling hops, which go into the first part of the brew. And they may be, some people may put them in as the flour, which I've got this bag of old hops. You know, some people may put it in just this flour bud. Other people may purchase hops in pellet form. Some people put them in a bag with cheesecloth. It doesn't matter, but if you're putting them in pellet form, just be aware that they're going to dissolve and make anything that you're straining, your ingredients that you're taking out of the liquid, more difficult to strain. And you may have to filter your beer more if there's a lot of particulate matter. Then there's finishing hops that you put in towards the last couple minutes of your brew. And I have a nice slide I'll show you in a second that shows some of the different qualities of the hops, but basically the idea is these longer boils for the boiling hops are releasing these molecules that have more bitter qualities, and the finishing hops, because they're only being boiled for a few minutes, are going to leave molecules that have a fruitiness and a little bit more flavor and aroma. So they're doing different things to your beer batch. And then there's dry hopping, which can bring out some other qualities and complexities to your beer. And that's primarily once you're done making your beer, you're putting them in and infusing them into the liquid. And like I said, you know, this is typically like a 4 to 5 hour event. You're using very hot liquid, and you need to let your beer, once you go through all the different steps, and at the end when you're getting ready to put it into your 5-gallon bucket, you need to make sure that the beer is a temperature that's not going to harm your yeast. So if you can't touch it or it feels really hot on the outside of the container, you just need to wait, because if you put your yeast in, you can potentially ruin the whole thing. I've only killed these once. It's fairly resilient, but the rule of thumb is, you know, if you can't touch the liquid, it's definitely going to burn and hurt the yeast. And then as far as fermentation goes, 1 month is lucky. An IPA is a typical one. It's a faster fermentation. Other beers, they take a lot longer, and there's nothing wrong with once your beer is done fermenting, so that's all of the yeast eating the sugars that you put into the liquid and releasing CO2. So it's metabolizing the sugar and putting alcohol into the liquid, you know, which we want for the alcohol content of the beer, and releasing CO2 as gas, which gets released out. I thought I had an airlock. So there's this little thing called an airlock, and you fill, this goes into the top of a carboy where you put your beer. So this is a 5-gallon carboy. You can also do like a growler if you wanted. I've seen people just do a smaller amount if you can scale the recipe. But so what this thing does is it, one, keeps the elements outside from interacting with your beer, where you chose your yeast on purpose for a certain reason and your ingredients, and it keeps them away from the yeast that's naturally in the air. But then it also has water in here that the gas bubbles of CO2 filter through and get released. So there's nothing to say, like going back to how long it takes, there's nothing to say that you can't just like keep your airlocked beer that's done fermenting in a carboy for a couple of months just sitting there. And I've done this tons of times because, you know, before the pandemic, sometimes I get really busy and, you know, just keep putting it off, bottling or, you know, whatever I was going to do with it. So you might be able to, if you're using a recipe that has a quick turnaround with fermentation, brew it, and a month later have it bottled, and then maybe a couple weeks later have your finished carbonated beer. But usually it's a couple months. So things to think about if you wanted to just start brewing at home and replace your beer purchasing. You have to have a calendar of beer. And there are some beers that are better in the summer, not just because they're lighter, but there's actually some that ferment better in warmer climates versus like winter temperatures. All right, bottling. I was thinking about showing you some of my cupboards in the kitchen, which are completely filled with both finished beer in bottles and empty bottles. But this is a really great way we can be sustainable, is to collect really nice bottles and to use them over and over again. There are some great brands like Dogfish Head where the label comes off very easily, and so you can have this nice looking clean set of bottles. You can also buy bottles at a beer store. I think this is filled with caps, at least it says it is. If you do bottle a beer there's a variety of these caps which are open, and you can purchase a capper, which is this thing that you just put the cap on top of the bottle of beer, and there's a magnet here to help you align it, and you just go like that to close them. So that's a really simple method of bottling. You can also get a kegerator and keg your beer, which I think is a lot easier, and I'm starting to lead towards maybe wanting to do that to to get my cabinets back at some time. I think it's a little more streamlined, but there is an investment into getting that equipment. Yeah, so you plan, you get your ingredients, you brew, you ferment, you bottle it, you drink it. It's pretty basic. So here at my house, we're doing this with cider, we're doing this with honey, we're doing this with beer. And I have some example brewing steps here, and I think I'm going to go through this slide and then I'll stop and see if there's any questions. But thinking about the whole process, you need to sanitize all your equipment. I use a sanitizer that you dilute in water. It's an iodine-based sanitizer. There are a couple other ways of doing this. I use that for all my equipment except the bottle caps, which I boil for about 10 minutes just on my stovetop. A lot of people are always concerned like something bad is going to happen, like some disease will get in there, something will get in there if you don't sanitize things correctly. The most likely thing that's going to happen is that you're going to get a crappy, skunky batch of beer. So you have to be careful to sanitize it, but all the time I tell people I make beer and they're like, oh, you might get something, you might get something. And I just always think, these monks were doing this in caves hundreds of years ago. They didn't have nearly as many tools as we have now. And I've actually never had a skunky batch of beer. So I know it happens. I think a lot of times it's more likely associated with not having a proper airlock. But you want this to be a controlled environment. You don't necessarily want the yeast from the air in there unless you want to, experiment with that, which is also totally fine. It's just a little bit safer to control everything. So, what you do, you just get your recipe and you follow the steps. I read my recipes about 6 times before I start going. And I always have a helper, at least one person helping me, whether it's, holding something or getting me water or just keeping me on track of time or taking the temperature. So what you're doing really is you need to get a large pot, like something that can hold a few gallons of water. So something that's bigger than your average, maybe like large cooking, like spaghetti or like Buddha bowl steamer pot. I actually got my pot, which is called a wort pot, from a thrift store. It's aluminum, which isn't the best material because sometimes the middle of it can get a little hot. I've also used it for making large batches of canning, and it's just not as the heating is not as good as some of the other metals. So something to think about if you have a choice and you really want to invest in it. A nicer wort pot is going to help you have a more consistent temperature throughout your brew. So what you do is you add barley and malts, the typical ingredients, into a certain amount of water. It's usually a gallon or 2. And you're going to use a thermometer. You can use something, just a really, really simple thermometer. Like this one. I've also seen people use one of like the laser ones that you shoot at the top of the liquid to get a reading. But you're gonna steep these ingredients at 150 to 160 Fahrenheit for about 30 minutes. And so you've got a bunch of barley and malt, so grains floating around in liquid, some hops too, most likely. And you're gonna wanna strain out those solids and put all the liquid back into the wort pot. So you have to think about like, where you're gonna put that liquid, what you're going to do with those barley and malts. And I have to say, if you can freeze them in maybe like 1 cup containers, you can actually use these spent grains in pizza dough, and it's so good. So I highly recommend trying to reuse them if you can. Then there's going to be a whole bunch of other ingredients that you put into that water. So you've taken away your barley and malts, your suspended solids, put them somewhere, hopefully maybe for a pizza later, or in your compost if you want to do that. And then you're adding malt extracts, which are either, this was actually from a liquid, and we're using this container for my bottle caps, but they're either liquid in a container like this or in a can, or I'm trying to see if I have any ingredients I can show you. Here's some black malt. You can see it's just like a grain. I have some wheat flakes from a different beer I did. I don't actually have any of the powdered malts handy, but there's also some malts where it's a powdered substance that has been dehydrated that's in a bag. And when you put those back in, you need to stir this a lot, especially because if you have the powdered malt extract, it clumps up into the strangest meringue-like sticky solid, and you actually have to spend some effort stirring and breaking it down and making sure that it's completely dissolved. So then that's the part of the brew that you use your boiling hops for, and it's about a 60-minute process. And then there's these 2 critical minutes at the end where you're going to add your finishing hops. And so if we go back here, you can see the boiling hops are for the bitterness. So an hour to an hour and a half of boiling, and the finishing hops are where you're going to get like some of that aroma and flavor and fruitiness. Dry hops I don't usually use, but I know a lot of people that like to experiment with them. So back to kind of like the steps, you've got this water that's steeped with barley and malt. The bitterness from the hops have been infused in there. There's some sugars from these malt extracts. Gypsum is just a stabilizing agent. It's a white powder. I thought I had some handy, but I don't know where I put it right now. But yeah, so you might put that in there. There's other niche ingredients in some recipes. They're usually to preserve some aspect of the flavor to stabilize the boil. So then after that, what you do is you still have some things floating around in your liquid that you need to take out, because like we don't want to drink beer with a bunch of like these like hops in getting in your mouth. So you do this thing called straining and sparging, and sparging is just really pouring cold water over all the solids. And so I use I have a sieve, but so you're just straining out and washing all those ingredients to get your beer. And so I'm usually doing that in the 5-gallon bucket, which you can see there's a mark on here. If you buy one of these from the store, it's really good to see where the 5-gallon mark is. I think a couple of people I knew when they started this thought that all the way to the top was 5 gallons, but that's not correct. Some of them may have it labeled on there. So you're putting all of that into a bucket like this. There's a cap that goes on it. Maybe you'll have like 3 gallons of that liquid and have to sparge and rinse everything off to fill it up to 5. And then you're capping this and putting your airlock on it. And the reason we use these big buckets is because the early stages of fermentation can be kind of violent and bubbly. I've had some where I've had to get this thing, it's actually called a blowout tube. It's a large plastic tube where instead of having this thing on there, because it's just foaming and bubbling over the top, I've had to just like let it bubble out into a bowl for a day. But so this is your starting point, is this larger bucket, and you can continue to use that for the rest of your brew. But most people start the filtering process. There will be a bunch of dead yeast on the bottom, and this is like a much nicer clear, able to view environment. And the shape of this is really nice too, to help with releasing the CO2 as it's fermenting. But the first thing to do is just sparge everything into your bucket. Add water up to 5 gallons, wait for everything that's in there to cool. And I don't mean really cold, but just, to a body temperature heat so you can add the yeast. And if you want to do dry hopping, you can, and then airlocking it and letting it ferment. So before we go further and get into a little bit more about the hops plant, does anyone have any questions? I see there's a couple in the chat. I know this is probably a lot of information, especially for people that haven't done beer making. Okay, how long will beer keep? Where can I buy hops for planting? Pilsners and lagers. Okay. Wow. Okay, so lots of questions. So how long will beer keep? It will keep a really long time. I've had beers for years. I think that, potentially if you kept it long enough, it would go bad, but I've actually never had any go bad. So I don't really know. I mean, I would say like you could probably have beer for 10 years. Every once in a while in the very backs of my, my cupboards, I find special beers that I've had for, like 4 or 5, 6, 7 years. And they're always still good. So buying hops for planting. I've bought hops for planting at Maryland Homebrew, which is in Columbia, Maryland. So it's about a 30-minute drive for me from DC. I think that they're still doing orders maybe with like curbside. I'm not really sure. They send me, I'm on their mailing list, which is a nice list to get on. And they were sending some COVID announcements out just with changes to their operations. But I would try there. There's also a variety of places on the internet where you can buy hops. And I have a picture too that I'll show you in a minute of what the rhizome looks like. And you want to plant it usually around this time of year. There was one year where I taught this class for Josh and the DC Gardens in, I think, July. And I thought that my hops was going to mold because I had it in the fridge and then it was really hot out. And I took it to the class and then I ended up planting it the day after that. And I thought it wouldn't survive, but it did. So, I mean, you read all this information on the internet about how particular they are. And they're actually very hardy, which, if you think back to their history, they made it to Europe and diversified growing in ditches. So these plants are pretty adaptable. So for pilsners and lagers, yeah, there probably are a variety of hops. I can look at my my book. I haven't made a lager for a while. I did make a pilsner, and I remember using a bunch of both Cascade hops because I was using the hops that were growing at one of the community gardens. And I just can't remember because I haven't made one for a while. But yes, there are definitely varieties that you probably would prefer, and I'll try to look that up before the class is over. But I'd say just, like Googling the internet and just doing some basic research if it seems like those varieties will grow here. Usually with those beers, what I've noticed is there's 1 or 2 types of hops that the recipes call for that you can grow here. Like for instance, I used one that had a Cascade hops. And then other ones that you have to get from the beer store for whatever reason. And probably the reason is there's not a lot of easily purchased hop rhizome available from these brew stores. But I would definitely check with Maryland Homebrew because they have a large distribution and they do have a lot of variety. And the hops rhizomes are cheap, maybe like I think $7, $8, $9, something like that. And when I first started looking into this, I thought that my hops would stop producing after 4 years, but it's actually still producing quite a bit. And so there's a lot of guidance about rotating your hops crop out and things like that. And so I'm still kind of new to growing it. And I haven't, with my small scale operation, really seen the need to do that. So the process for using dry hops is another question. Oh wait, hold on. Okay, so there's one. Okay, so how do the hop plants do over winter? Okay, so the hops plant is just dormant over winter. I cut mine down every year, and every spring, a little, here's part of it, a little fuzzy group of vines starts growing, and I have some pictures in the presentation about it, but yeah, it just starts trying to spread and grow, and you have to cut part of it back, so it's just dormant over winter. And you can use any kind of soil, but if you live in DC, I really recommend getting your soil tested. For example, at my house, it's off of Rhode Island Avenue. There's a legacy of pollution, like not only from paint and industry in the city, but also from lead in gas and things like that. So you can easily get your soil tested at one of the universities. I think we got ours tested at University of Maryland. It's really cheap, like $15, $20. And you can just take a couple soil samples. There's a method on the internet that tells you how to do it. So there's a lot of places that you can test your soil, or you can, even put it into a planter box. It can grow on even like a patio. I've seen some really cool trellises and box gardens of hops. So I'd say, over 5 gallons of soil is usually ideal. So even just like one of the paint buckets probably would be an easy and inexpensive bucket for growing them. So the process for using dry hops is literally after I would say to wait a couple of days after the really busy fermentation is going on, and you literally just put the hops into your carboy with all your beer and your yeast that's fermenting, and letting it infuse. Again, like, this is not something that I do a lot of. I have a friend that does it, but some people will leave it in for like a week. Other people will leave it in for a few days. You might be able to research beers that you like that use dry hopping. And then you filter it out, and we can talk a little bit more about how to do that. But with my beer, I usually filter it 2 or 3 times, because what happens is everything settles to the bottom, and you want to take the liquid and move it between different containers. So you'll sanitize your carboy, like a different one, or a bucket, and move the liquid, but leave all the sludge of dead yeast cells and anything like, particulate matter at the bottom. And you'll filter that out. And I just basically do it until there's a manageable, maybe inch layer of sludge at the bottom. And you just avoid putting that in the bottle. Yeah, so dry hops is just an infusion into your final beer, and you could do it when you right after you put the yeast in. I think that would be fine too, but with all the bubbling, it might jam up your airlock, so there's always the potential for that. So there's some information about caring for hops, and they're growing, letting them go wild, allowing the shoots to grow, and cutting that back. So I think I have a little bit more information on some of these other slides, so I'll try to touch on that, and if I don't, we can come back to it. Yeah, so this is, I had this slide in here because a lot of times when I've done the community garden class, it's not my house where I can just grab everything. I'd say if you get the joy of home brewing, there's a really extensive list of all the equipment, but at the most basic level, I would say invest in a 5-gallon bucket, invest in a carboy. That'll run you maybe $50. You could probably get it used. Get a couple of airlocks and these stoppers. I would say get a thermometer. Get a graduated cylinder. There's this other tool here. This device that you can get at a beer store. The triple scale beer and wine hydrometer. So this allows you pour some of your beer that you've made into this cylinder, and you put this in here, and depending on how much it floats, you can take a reading on here, and that will tell you how much alcohol is in your beer. So that's pretty essential. In addition, oops, sorry, I'm putting things in all the wrong places. In addition, you have to think about if you want to do bottling. If you want to do bottling, I would say shoot for having, if you're drinking the 60 ounce, about 60 nice bottles. I also have some larger 22 ounce bottles, which that makes the whole brewing go faster. You can get ones that have the cap already on there, which saves a lot of time. But then you have to get bottle caps. I have all different color bottle caps because I label each beer with a unique color and code if I can. And so that helps you keep track of your different batches. And I write the code in my journal. Anyway, you're gonna need a brush to clean things. You're gonna need a tube. And you're gonna need this little wand for bottling, which there's a stopper at the bottom that when you push it into the bottom of the bottle, it's flowing, and then when you pull it out, it stops. Capper. I think that's probably all the basic equipment. I might be forgetting something. Yeah, so you don't need a lot of stuff. So for like $100, and once you have the bottles, you can make your beer for a lot, like really good beer for less than $1 a bottle, which I think is pretty awesome. So once you make the initial investment, it definitely pays off. I think we talked a little bit about this. Well, maybe not. Okay, so this is actually bottling. I take it back. We didn't really talk a lot about this. When you bottle your beer, and I promise we'll get back to hops here, I think after this slide, you need to also sanitize all your bottles. And one thing you can do is wash them in your dishwasher and use the heat drying setting. You can also fill your 5-gallon bucket up with water and put one of the iodine or other sanitizing agents in it, and just dunk the bottles for whatever it indicates, 30 seconds to a minute, depending on what type it is. You need to sanitize your wand, your tube, and because you're gonna be basically you're gonna be laying out all the bottles that are sanitized and ready to go, having the caps boiled and ready to go, and you're gonna move your beer from your carboy into another sanitized bucket. So there's a lot of just like moving the ingredients around in this whole thing. But then you're going to have to add some sugar, usually fructose, a bottling sugar that's dissolved in water into your beer. So like liquid into liquid, to reactivate the yeast that does not have any sugar because it's fermented at all, so that it will release CO2 in your bottle to carbonate your beer. And the sugar you have at your house is not the same as bottling sugar, but there are a lot of online tools, like if you for some reason forget to get it, where you can calculate how to make that solution. Because I think the fear is that potentially if you use too much sugar, your bottle could explode. And everyone always says like, oh, like it can blow up, but I've never had that happen. I've been doing this for 20 years. And the entire time I've like known so many people that have brewed beer. I had one person who made the really poor decision of putting it's actually a cider, putting their cider like on a shelf above their computer and they didn't airlock it properly, so the air wasn't able to get out. They weren't watching to see that bubbles were moving through here, and it actually like popped up and spilt everywhere. So out of a very large sample size, it's very uncommon. There's also these carbonation drops that you can just put 1 drop of sugar into each bottle. It's really simple. And that will carbonate your beer. Yeah, so I think the point is, there's a lot of moving the ingredients around. The final step before bottling is adding a little bit of sugar back into your mix, bottling it, capping, and waiting, 2 weeks to a couple months for it to carbonate. I keep records in my beer journal, and I set reminders of when I think it will carbonate, and to just try one to put in the fridge and see if it's done. And it really varies a lot. But you want to make sure that you're stirring everything as you're bottling it, just so that there's a even consistency of the sugar. Okay, so now back to hops. So the green part of the plant is called the crown, and hops is really a rhizome. So if you think of blackberries and raspberries, they have runners that they send up. So there's really not a lot to do to care for hops when they're growing, which is one of the really cool things about them. They're super easy. The thing to be aware of is if you were here and touching this, there are a lot of really sharp, the botanical word is pubescent hairs on here. Every once in a while I'll be out by my hops in my flip-flop and it will just go along my toe, or I'll pull it without a glove on, and it will really scratch you quite bad. I mean, obviously, you know, like not bad enough that it's going to bleed, but it's an irritant. So this plant has a defense, which is these pubescent hairs all over it that are really aggressive. So what you do really is you just plant this rhizome, preferably in the spring, and you plant it either near something that it can wind and grow up, or else it will just go out. Or, you know, I have a picture of this. You can plant it in a bucket with a trellis or a pole or something like that. So, and what happens is it's very bushy when it comes back year after year. The first year it will be much more simple. It will look a little bit more like this picture. It will have one or two main shoots. It doesn't really matter if you get all of the extra tendrils off of it. There's a lot of information that's like, you know, just let one piece of it grow up, and if you don't do that, you won't get as high of a yield and things like that. I mean, I do cut quite a few of them back, but I always leave a couple out there just in case something happens to my main one. Another thing to note is this is very flimsy. I just bent it. If you bend it like this, it will die. And so you need to, once it's maybe 2 feet long, start training it to whatever you want to do, or maybe earlier, and starting to get rid of those additional runners. But you need to be really careful because, you know, if you pull it, it might hurt your hand. If you take too many of them out or bend it, it might not be able to reach its full growing potential. So yeah, so to answer this question, you can let some of the shoots go wild. You know, the scientists have found a relationship between the yield and the number of shoots, where the fewer the shoots, the more energy the plant puts into the hops. And so you just have to make your own decision. And right now mine, I can show you a picture of, I think I put in the slide deck. It has quite a few shoots, and I'll probably take a couple more off once it's more established. And it's actually taller than me. So they shoot up really quick. So you have to pay attention to them when they start going, and remove extra ones. And then there's information about wires and strings, questions about this. Yeah, so I'd say go for a few strong vines, you know, preferably like 1 to 3 per rhizome, but you know, it can be a couple more. And yeah, it can grow up anything, wires, strings. Let me see if my picture of my plant is next. I'll just skip to it really quick. Oops. So here's my house, and it grows up this post on my deck. You can see it's really bushy. This is how it was before I started cutting some of it back. But yeah, so it will grow up just about anything, wire, string. If you have some sort of, it can grow like how Virginia creeper grows. I see a lot of restaurants having lights and things like that, or you know, some kind of patio, and they use Virginia creeper, but you can also do that with hops. And I think Pub and the People has on North Capitol, which is in my neighborhood, they have some hops plants growing there, at least they did last year. So it creates a very beautiful environment for your outdoor space. All right, so here's where we just get into a little bit more details about the plant um, anatomy. Um, the the hop flower is extremely sticky. Um, if you touch it, you will get a stickiness all over your fingers. Um, this plant, Humulus lupus, is in the Cannabaceae family. Like marijuana is the popular plant in that family, but also like trees like hackberry. Um, so I mean, the thing is it's very aromatic. It has a lot of these glands that are producing these essential oils and resins, and this is really where all that aroma and bittering uh, comes into being infused into your beer. Um, so there's also male and female plants. These come from rhizomes that we were just talking about. And if you really are, a beer aficionado, there's all kinds of information about like beta acids, acids, and things like that. But at the most basic level, the eupalin glands are what are used for the bittering and flavor in beer. So if you look at the picture, it's like that. It's almost like pollen. It's like this sticky oil that the plant excretes. There's also resins and oils, and these have a lot of flavors, and there's a huge diversity like per strain. It's really cool. If you I think I have a picture of this in the slide deck, but if you look this up, like the difference between the different varieties of hops in how many or what percentage of the plant has these different characteristics, and which specific types of molecules that they have, it's so diverse. It's super interesting. I think a lot of brewers hear about alpha acids and like bitterness scales and things like that. These are the compounds that help also bring out some of that bitterness. And there's the International Bitterness Unit, which is a thing that I mostly hear about if I hear a commercial about beer, but people take this really serious, and they assign a bitterness unit to certain beers. But this is actually related to the alpha acids in the hops. And we're talking about like the different lengths of boiling times, and really like with these alpha acids, like for that first part of your brewing, for the boiling hops, the molecule is actually going through an isomerization process, which is like a chemical change from the heat. So it's actually changing the structure at the bond level, and being able to release the bitterness compounds. There's a lot of science that has gone into understanding how this all works. And I know that, a lot of people aren't scientists. I'm a scientist, but I don't study this. So there's a lot of it that's way over my head, but it is cool to learn some of this basic vocabulary. And all hops are described based off of these qualities. So bitterness, aroma, flavor, mouthfeel, foam and lacing, flavor stability, and antimicrobial to beer, which is like goes back to the whole idea of the English put the hops in their ale, in their pale ale, making the India Pale Ale for the long journey to India. So there is actually an antimicrobial quality to hops. But so people draw these spider diagrams, and the different colors as it gets further away from the center means that there's more of that quality. And so this is just an example of the different qualities for a cold infusion of the hops and the raw hops. And so I find these diagrams to be kind of telling, like if there are certain flavors that like if you really want a fruity beer, you should go for one that has like that floral or fruity character. But it's very specific too. I mean, like all these different flavors, like woody, aromatic, red berries. I have this great book, I think it's just called The History of Hops, that I got at a bookstore, and it has tons of these spider diagrams. And I think it's fun sometimes to just look at how different and diverse the different hops are. And we can do chat again. I don't see anything else there, but if you have any questions about that, I can try to answer them. But a lot of this information, like I have reference books and I look it up. So there is a lot of information on this slide. And I guess what I was trying to portray is that this, growing the hops is pretty easy. I mean, you saw my plant. I tried to have 2 of them here and one of them just didn't make it. I have a couple at the community gardens around here, different varieties that are more adapted to, like, for example, like Wangari, which is walking distance from my house. I put in a plant that was a little more flood tolerant because a lot of years I'd go there and there was a lot of standing water. But they're pretty hardy plants. And you can see up in the top right, this is what a hops farm looks like. So a lot of the properties by where I used to do field work in Oregon had massive plantations of this. And I'm meeting a lot of people in Virginia. There was an interest in growing hops there too. And I think that we might see more hops growing in this region. But generally for soil, you want it to be as well drained as possible. I don't really think my soil is that well drained and it does okay. But if you want ideal conditions, a little bit more loamy, definitely well drained, and a pH that's a little bit more basic. They like to be in the direct sun. I can tell you that, a couple of places where I planted them around here, very urban, heat island effects of the city, some really intense summer temperatures, and they're very happy. They like a climate that has 120 frost-free days, which I don't know how many we have here, but we definitely have at least that many. As you may recall, this last year, I don't know that we had more than 1 or 2 frosts. So we had a pretty extended growing season this last year. Avoid overwatering. I don't actually water my hops plant. I have a bunch of plants above it that I water, herbs and like a tomato and a bucket and things like that. So I know that they're getting water that is primarily targeting these other plants. But I really don't think that here you really have to water it. I've never seen any sign of it being starved for water. And so I think that's a really huge bonus to this plant. Best practice is to plant the rhizome early. You want the bud part to be pointing upwards. This is some specific information in here about how to space them. I can say that I've broken a lot of these rules and it was fine. If you look in the lower right-hand corner, these are 2 different ideas of ways that you can string up your hops that I think are really effective for the types of yards and gardens that I see here. But I would say be creative. They will follow whatever you put up. I mean, it doesn't have to be like a big post like my deck, like in that picture I was showing. Towards the top of it, I just have like a piece of hemp twine. And there was 1 year where we almost got it to go all the way up to the 2nd story. So that's the basement. It always goes up to the 1st story. And there was 1 year where we almost got it up to the 2nd story, but then I think that we maybe harmed part of the vine. So they will grow really, really high. And I have a friend here in DC that actually grows it all the way up to the 2nd story of their house. So 3 whole floors with the way it's situated, which is really amazing. But usually they'll grow like 10, 12 feet high. They are susceptible to diseases in some areas. In Oregon, this was a huge issue. There's a thing called powdery mildew. There's also some aphids that like them. I have aphids in my garden, and the ones around here, at least the type I have, which are a bluish color, have not infested them to date. So I've been really lucky with that, but in some areas they may be prone to some of these insect pests. Supposedly they can be poisonous to some dogs and cats, and I don't know what the some means. And this is a fact that when I did this class the first time, and I was just researching it on the internet and some of my books, I found these statements, but I never have heard of anyone's animal being harmed by hops. But they are very strong. There's lots of, like we were looking back at all the different compounds that are in them that we appreciate for the beer taste, and for the other like medicinal qualities. But I would just be aware of this. I can't really imagine a dog or a cat eating this plant because, like I said, it's kind of not comfortable to even touch like this. It's kind of prickly. But some animals, like we had a pet that would eat a lot of different things. So I would be aware if you have animals that are sensitive and keep an eye on them to make sure that they're not interested in eating it. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here. I think we talked about a lot of this, and this is an old slide. I started teaching this class for Josh a couple years ago. I thought, like 3 years, I would get rid of my hop rhizome and get a new one, but it's still going on strong. So yeah, so I'm learning things about hops in DC as I go. As far as picking them, I like to cut them off of the vine towards the end of the summer, usually in August. And they will be a very light green color. And I usually take them right when they start to dry a tiny bit on the vine. And then I just leave them on trays in my house, like baking trays, in the sunlight to dry them. I think I've always been apprehensive of putting it in my food dehydrator because I thought that even with some of those low herb settings, for like the people sometimes use for drying like oregano or basil or whatever, I was always afraid that maybe that heat would release some of the compound, like some of the lighter, more volatile but flavorful compounds. So I don't know if that's true or not, but I've always just let them dry, and they dry really fast, like just in a couple of days. And then what I do is I put them in Ziploc bags and I freeze them if I'm using them for beer. If you have one of those or what are they called? The food sealers. A lot of people vacuum seal them, and I think that that's probably the best thing to do if you have that, and you want to store them for a longer time period. And then we talked a little bit about the whole leaf, which is what you get if you grow your own versus the pellets. I have to say, the first beer I made out here, I had no idea that there was a thing that was pellet hops. It's basically just pulverized hops in a pellet. And I threw that into my beer mixture, and I was very surprised by it. I'm not a fan of it just because it clogs a lot of my filtering. But I have friends that swear that, it tastes just as good. So it may just be a personal preference. Okay, there's my plant. You can see it again. So I don't know if you can see on this, but there is a piece of string at the top where it goes up the pole and then onto the string. And we just kind of weave it around our deck, and it's very beautiful. So we really have enjoyed this plant, and I wouldn't recommend letting it get as wild as in this picture over here, but because it just started shooting up in the last week and a half, we've been giving a little bit of space to make sure that this main vine is going to be successful. And then we have some information about all the different varieties, and as you can see here, there's quite a few. I mean, just the American varieties, there's 45. And I would say, like, if you want to know more about this, I would just search the internet. It's kind of cool to learn about them, but I would focus on the American, English, and German, just because those are, unless you like a niche beer. But these are some popular rhizomes. Willamette, Cascade, Chinook, Liberty, and Mount Hood. And as you may guess, these are all words that have, except Liberty, which have something to do with the Pacific Northwest, because they were named by people out there. And so Willamette hops, classic beer is like a fat tire. The amber ale has a lot of Willamette hops in it. Cascade, lots of these IPAs, Sierra Nevada, the Anchor Brewing are very bitter, but very palatable, like strong Cascade. This is what I grow. I have a Willamette hop in a Wangari garden, and I don't know if it's still there this year, but it had been there before. And I also had a Liberty and a Mount Hood there as well. And then it says here actually Mount Hood is the classic lager hop, so that may answer part of the question that someone had about lagers. I don't think that I actually used Mount Hood when I made a lager, but I'm going to try to look that up because it has been a while. Yeah, so there's a lot to learn. I would say if you are interested in getting hops, I would start with Maryland Homebrew. I would say, like Willamette or Cascade or Chinook would probably be like some really easy ones to grow here. But there's probably other ones that you can get to. And I think that when I got mine, they had at least 8 that you could choose from. So I think that they often, they get them, they're refrigerated, and like it's usually something that you place the order a little bit earlier than now, but I would check with them. Like I think it's maybe something you have to think ahead and excuse me, and maybe like February or March, and let them know, and they like you pay them and they get it for you. I think there is a question. So does the higher percent alpha acids always mean more bitter beer? Yes and no. So the more alpha acids there are, the more likely that it's going to have a higher bitterness unit. But it's also related to the type of the hops, the amount that you put in, and probably how you not only like the volume that you put in, but the amount of time that you boil it. And if the hops that you put in release all of their acids. But I think in general, yes, to some extent, that the more alpha acids, the more bitter. So I think I may have one more slide of resources. So I'm just going to put this up and let you guys read this. I'm going to look up the lager really quick in here to see if I can better advise you based off of what my friend says and what I've seen at stores around here on the internet. And then feel free if there are any other questions. Yep. I would also say if you want to make beer, I would say just start with either a pale ale or an IPA because you're less likely to mess it up. Those are just really easy beers to make. Yeah, I'd have to actually look up a lager recipe. I'm not seeing any really basic information here. I could look at my other book, but give me a second. I'm gonna look for you. Okay, here's one of my books. Hopefully you guys can still hear me. For the Love of Hops. I don't know if this is gonna have more. This is actually a really like cool history book in the beginning. And then it's a lot of kind of over my head detailed information about the hops plant. No, anyway, yeah, so I would say, and this is completely based off of my preferences that I don't know as much about this, but I'm sure you can find some general information about that on the internet. And I mean, even calling the people at Maryland Homebrew, they are amazing and very helpful. One thing I want to note, I used to go to 3 Stars a lot to get, packaged hops and beer making supplies. They're only focusing now on the distribution of their beer line. There's also a brew store in Arlington. So, I mean, I would search to see, I don't know if everyone is actually in DC or not, but there's probably a variety of small stores, and the small stores are great. I learn so much every time I go to the store. And so this is one of the kind of sad things about the pandemic is the interactions with the people that have these niche businesses are very knowledgeable, and they often do really fun things. The people that really got me into making beer was my local beer store where I lived in Oregon. And they did anything from, you know, fermenting inside a pumpkin from one of the staff's family farm, you know, for like the pumpkin ale, to doing tastings of different beers so that you can, you know, be an educated consumer. I'm always a big fan of learning about the food and the drink. Yeah, so I think that this is probably everything I had, and I'd welcome any other questions or feedback. This is my personal email. You know, I'm just a person here that lives in DC that has a bunch of garden projects going on. You know, we make a lot of different fermented things here at my house. And then with the DC garden series, I usually, and probably we can't do this year, I usually try to do a cider press. This is something to, you know, pivoting from hops a little bit, but there are some hop ciders, which are kind of fun. The DC gardens have this cider press that you, if you're certified, I believe if you're certified in using the tool lending library or whatever they call it, you can use the cider press. So if you do have apple trees or know someone that does, or want to buy a bunch of apples from a farmer's market, you can actually press apples. And we try sometimes to do a community cider press, which is really fun, where people bring their own apples. So there is a slight possibility that that will happen in the fall. But if not, there is a resource that potentially people can be trained to use, that is just, you know, for everyone that participates and is in DC that uses the community gardens. So I don't see any other questions, but I'm happy to take them, and feel free to, you know, if you want to use the chat or turn off the mute. I'm just going to sit here for a couple more minutes, and if you want to sign off, you can. If you want to, you know, ask me something else, I can, you know, I can try to look things up for you. I can go back to different slides if you want to look at them, so just let me know. But I really appreciate everyone joining and asking good questions and being interested in this. I think that the hops plant is really beautiful, and it's definitely a really fun hobby to make beer. It can be a lot of work, but it's also a great community building thing. You know, it's a great way to make friends and to teach people. And, you know, I think like as hobby gardeners and home brewers, we're all, you know, just learning as we go. It's all adaptive management of our crops, and there are special challenges in the urban area. So we really, you know, we really enjoy sharing. Oh yeah, so someone's saying there was an exhibit at the National Arboretum. That's really cool. I did not see that, but I love the Arboretum, and I'm sad that it's closed right now because I think they were getting some pretty heavy traffic in there. But yeah, that would be something to look at. You know, going back to the resource, going back to the resources slide, if my computer will load. Sorry, I'm just going to put this here. The Hurech House Museum over by DuPont, they actually have this really great history of hops course, which is, you know, a class that's done by a professional. And Right Proper over by Shaw, which is, you know, by me, their brewer also has sometimes a class too. And so I would check there. You know, I see these classes a lot, and they're fun to participate in. I wouldn't be surprised if the Botanical Garden, I think in the past they've had a class on either hops or tinctures, or, you know, something related to the plants that go into beer. So I think there are a lot of resources in DC for you to explore. But yeah, the National Arboretum, the Botanic Garden, Any of these breweries probably would be great places to start. The Heurich House Museum is fun to visit. You know, there's even like a DC hop cooperative, with people that, the Fishbowl Brewery. So people in DC that I've met, a lot of the bars when they were open would have like homebrew events. So I wish you all luck in growing hops and your fermentation pursuits. I'm going to just give another minute for any final questions. If not, we'll wrap it up, and I hope everyone has a good night. All right, good night, everyone. Stay healthy, safe. Cheers. Remember, sit back, relax, have a home brew. That's the motto. All right, take care. Bye.